gentlemen, my name is Torunika Roy, and I'm a research assistant at the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. It is with great pleasure that I extend a warm welcome to another edition of the ICS's Wednesday seminar titled China's Industrial Policy, Analyzing Words versus Deeds. Since the reform and opening up era began in 1978, China's industrial policy objectives have shifted from increasing productivity and attracting investments to privatizing state-owned enterprises and prioritizing innovation. While the five-year plans are well-known sources of policy, other initiatives like Made in China 2025 and 10,000 Little Giants also play significant roles. This seminar will explore whether China's industrial policy aligns with its actual implementation. The seminar will also examine whether Chinese policymakers' words match their deeds and the effectiveness of the instruments they use for industrial policy. The speaker for today's session is Dr. Alicia Garcia Herrero, a senior fellow at Bruegel and chief economist for Asia Pacific at Natixis in Hong Kong. She holds various esteemed positions, including non-resident senior fellow at the East Asian Institute, NUS, adjunct professor at HKUST, and advisor to multiple organizations. With a PhD in economics from George Washington University, Dr. Garcia Herrero is recognized for her thought leadership and active presence in international and social media, including being named among LinkedIn's top voices in economy and finance in 2017 and number 6 in top social media leaders by Refinitiv in 2020. The chair for today's session is Mr. Santosh Pai, a dual qualified cross-border lawyer in India and the UK. He is a partner at Denton Slink Legal, a member of the core group on China at the Confederation of Indian Industry, and a treasurer and honorary fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies. His expertise includes Chinese investments in India, comparative law, and board governance. Mr. Pai holds degrees from NLSIU Bangalore, Tsinghua University, and Villaric University. His notable publications include Arbitration Law and Practice in India and Legal Guide for Taiwanese Investors in India. Before I hand over to the chair, I would like to ask all the participants to follow a few housekeeping rules. All participants are requested to remain muted during the seminar. You may post your questions in the chat box along with your name and affiliation. Alternatively, you may use the raise your hand option during the interactive session. After the presentation, you will be called upon to unmute yourself and ask questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Toronika. And thank you everyone for joining us. We are indeed honored to have Alicia with us. She is currently occupying a very enviable position based in Taiwan, observing China closely, having access to a great amount of data coming out of China and still following it closely, while the rest of the world seems to have focused on decoupling itself from China. So Alicia is today one of the unique voices which examines Chinese economy, industrial policy, and amongst the two big reasons she's here are the two papers she's recently published, which I think bridge a very crucial gap in the understanding of China's industrial policy. The first one came out a few months ago. How does China conduct industrial policy, analyzing words versus deeds? When I read this paper, there were a lot of things that struck me. One was the objective of actually clarifying, and clearing some misconceptions, because a lot of people think due to China's great state capacity, it is actually capable of delivering exactly what the policymakers want and implementing industrial policy to great levels of perfection. The second, of course, was the alignment between the national level and state level implementation of policies, which again generates a great deal of interest for researchers. So the paper addressed both these questions, and the methodology itself, using language learning models and so on, all the modern tools that researchers should be using, was again very interesting for me to read. So that's when I invited Alicia for a Wednesday seminar. And before we could get our dates together, she came out with one more very interesting paper, which has to do with unpacking China's industrial policy and its implication for Europe. So she drew very interesting parallels, which are also interesting for us, but also maybe using the India perspective, we can use some of the same frameworks to see how India's industrial policy is also performing against its stated objectives. So this paper covers various parameters, like how is China doing in terms of value addition of manufacturing, to space technology, electric vehicles, a whole number of interesting issues. And the last point is 2 weeks ago, the Ministry of Finance in China came out with a clarification on the 10,000 small giants policy, almost as if they took into account Alicia's paper and corrected some of the inefficiencies that had crept in into the implementation. So I'll stop here. These are some of the big reasons we have Alicia with us today. And she has volunteered to go beyond these two papers and also maybe address some of the questions which the audience throws up. I'm mindful of the fact that we have only 70 minutes today. So I'll request Alicia to take maybe the first 25 minutes to go through your excellent presentation, which you have also kindly prepared for our audience. And after that, I'll maybe take the liberty of posing a few questions to initiate a discussion. And then, of course, we'll throw open the session to the entire audience. Meanwhile, I request audience members to type their questions in the chat box. And we will also have questions from the YouTube link as and when they come up. So, Alicia, thank you again for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Well, first of all, thank you, Santosh. Thank you, Alka. And I know Shim Shankar is there also. Suman, I see many names, and I just want to thank everybody for being here. And without further ado, I'm going to go straight to the presentation because I realize it's quite long and we might not have enough time to go through all of the slides. I don't even mean to necessarily go through everything in detail. You can have a copy of the presentation, and of course the papers are including the journal paper. Actually, they are open access, so there's no problem with that. So why did we write this paper first? First, this China Horizon you see on the right-hand side of the screen is important because this is a project financed by the European Commission. This might be the case of India too. I hope so for your institute, that there is more and more interest about China, and that you do get access to funding, which is what we managed to do with this consortium, with a number of European universities and think tanks to work on China for 3 years. And that is really how we have managed to write these papers, because we had basically funding to both go to China and get the data, have research assistants, etc., data scientists, because we are indeed using a lot of documents with large language models, which we are processing. So all of that requires a lot of money, to be frank. So that's the good news. The European Commission seems to be quite interested now in projects that actually deal with understanding China from an independent point of view. This is kind of the key message from the Commission. We can't just rely on US sources. They're plenty, surely very good, but we want to have our own view about China. And that's how these China Horizons came about. Within that, and there's quite a few other papers we've published, you can check the webpage, China Horizons there. But one of the key issues we thought we should work on was industrial policy. Why did we choose this topic? Firstly, because you just have to read the third plenum. I mean, it's all about industrial policy. It's all about moving up the ladder, China kind of understanding the world as a world of struggle against mostly the West, to be frank. Security trumping really the third plenum. If you look at that word, how many times he was mentioned in the final final outcome of the plenum published last Sunday, you can tell that a lot is really about self-reliance. And one particular aspect of self-reliance is industrial policy. Now, China has been doing industrial policy for ages. The question is it evolving? Our sense is, yes, it is evolving in many ways, but ultimately the most important way in which it is evolving, and I think this is since Xi Jinping's era, is that innovation trumps industrial policy. So there's this very tight link between innovation and industrial policy. Industrial policy is there not to create employment or to, to expand, I don't know, revenue or you name it. No, it's there to move up the ladder, to achieve self-reliance. That's the ultimate objective. It's not even productivity, as we're going to argue. I'm going to argue later. It's really about self-reliance. So now, self-reliance while, of course, exporting your way out, meaning, yes, you don't depend on the world, but the world depends on you. That's kind of and by moving up the ladder with innovation, you achieve both goals. So this is the very specific, in a way, concept of industrial policy. And because the rest of the world has clearly seen China's industrial policy as very positive in the sense of very successful for China, at least this is my reading of how the rest of the world has seen this. There's been many others trying to see why not do this, say IRA in the US or Europe also pushing industrial policy. I'm sure that India has, a history of industrial policy too, but I have no doubt that China is influencing your own ideas about industrial policy. So the goal of these two papers is really to say, okay, is it so successful? Or why is it successful here but not there? Because I have the feeling that without understanding that, we may just copycat things that might not have been so successful after all. So that's really, really the crux of the matter here. And starting with this idea of words versus deeds in the first paper, meaning what you hear at the third plenum that China is going to do doesn't really mean it's what China is doing, and that's the deeds, the words versus the deeds. So let me go through the roadmap very quickly. So why is it relevant? I already went through that. How is this industrial policy conducted? Was it successful? And lessons for the world, not only for Europe, but I hope we can get more lessons for India in the Q&A. So yes, I already went through this. It's really about understanding how it works. And once we understand how it works, really benchmark that functioning of industrial policy in China to assess whether it's successful or not before that. So how does it work? Well, I would say that China's industrial policy, and this is really one of our key takeaways, and it is highly debatable and actually not proven in the paper in any way, because I don't think you can prove this. But to me, our reading of China's industrial policy after quite a few, reading quite a few documents and putting all of this in the context of China's economic model and also China's 5-year planning and so on, it seems to me that China's industrial policy needs to be read as part of China's party-state capitalism, but not necessarily as a promoter of state-led capitalism, but perhaps as a way to put so to weigh the private sector slightly better rather than the other way around. So in other words, if you look at China's subsidies, which there's many estimates out there, we have our own, which is based on public information, around 2% of GDP. You can go all the way to 6%. CSIS, other think tanks in the US have pushed the calculations by estimating, the shadow cost of land compared to what they pay. There's many ways to do this, but the point is that's not industrial policy. That's 90% of Chinese companies receive subsidies. So I can't call that industrial policy because it's basically across the board. I will show you that yes, some sectors receive more than others, and you can argue that is the differential treatment. But But frankly, in most cases, it's state-owned companies which receive the largest amount of subsidies. I'll show you that in a minute too. So actually, when you look at very specific industrial policy schemes, like the one we're going to investigate more thoroughly, which is the 10,000 Little Giants, and the reason is because the data is so much better than for the Made in China 2025, where we can't even identify which companies are treated, meaning are selected as part of that plan, while we can in these other 10,000 Little Giants. I'll introduce that to you in a minute. But what I mean to say is that when you narrowly focus on these industrial policy schemes, there you see that the private sector is actually receiving the bulk of it. So it seems to me that in a way, those very, very specific schemes are there to reduce the negative, quote unquote, or the unintended consequences of a party-state capitalism and the big role of SOEs. And that's how China, in a way, tries to balance efficiency versus ideology in economics. And that's why, in a way, the very broad reading of industrial policy, which would equate to state capitalism, to me is too broad. I mean, it's not what I want to study. I want to study those particular measures that protect or foster some companies versus others. And that's the bulk of our work, not state capitalism as such. I mean, China's economic model, which is, of course, very valuable. If many people are studying that, that's not what we do. So just a little bit of data there to show you that indeed the sectors where we talk, I mean, where we hear more about industrial policy, whether it's semiconductors, whether it's renewable energy, those are dominated by the private sector, not by either central SASAC or local SASAC companies. So that's where the action is, at least for these new plans. And the funds are not received necessarily by state-owned companies. So that's a very, very important point. However, when we look at overall support, again, not only subsidies, in this graph, this is called competitive neutrality, a concept that I wish I had seen in the third plenum, but without much success. It's not really there. It's a concept which the OECD uses. It was introduced by the Australian government. It's a concept to really measure whether companies, whether they are public or state-owned or private, are treated equally in an economy. And it goes beyond subsidies. You can calculate, for example, the effective tax ratio. So if they pay similar taxes for the same revenues, or if they have the same funding costs, or maybe because they have better access to funding, being state-owned companies, their funding costs are lower. So we compare for every single listed company in every sector in China, these two ratios beyond subsidies, which we control for, by the way. And you find there that in most cases, SOEs are clearly, well, in every case except the real estate sector, which is one in which POEs, private companies, receive as much funding, if not more, or in the form of lower taxes or lower funding costs. So just to say that in general, yes, of course, party state SOEs run the show. But then in very specific sectors, or for very specific programs like Made in China, like 10,000 Little Giants, this might not be the case. And that's why we kind of tend to analyze only that. So Made in China, everybody knows about this. The sectors covered: advanced manufacturing, biotech, transportation, aerospace, new energy vehicles. 10,000 Little Giants it's less known, but it's very, very important because it covers an increasing amount of companies, 10,000. Don't think they're very small. Many are listed, like around 500 of them are listed. We're not yet to fully 10,000 because there's some batches that are missing. But the point is, you also have very large companies there. It's just, in principle, these are kind of emerging companies, like companies that might be in sectors that were not covered by Made in China, that may be more niche. The companies could generally be small, but not always. And we cover this case in our empirical analysis for a very simple reason. It's because we can identify the companies. China publishes the list of companies in every single batch. We have now up to 6. Our study ends in the 5th batch because the 6th has been very, very recent. But the point is you can really see the names of the companies. If they are listed, you can see the financial statements, you can see everything. So it is a very good sample for empirical analysis, and we think it's quite relevant because also Made in China is coming to an end. So, this is kind of the new program for China. Well, this is only for those into, empirical research. This is the results of this paper where we analyze the 5 batches of 10,000 little giants. Let me just tell you what we find. So first of all, we look in the official documents to understand which are the variables that the local governments, because this is implemented at the local government level, governments care for to choose a company as a little giant. And they tell the companies in advance. They tell them, I want R&D intensity, meaning research and development intensity. You need to be more innovation oriented than your peers. That's one criteria. They don't say that you need to be small, although it is in the title, so we don't really focus on that. They also say you need to be profitable before we give you the funds, so we check profitability. And that's about it. So you need to be innovative and profitable. And this is another criterion, that's the one in red, I will explain in a minute. You need to be doing what I want you to do, meaning if I give you funds in the renewable sector, for the renewable sector pack of funds that I'm putting in front of companies, you need to be a renewable company, an EV company or solar panel company. That sounds logical and quite obvious. Well, it's the only variable that is highly negative in its coefficient, and they're insignificant. In other words, most companies receiving funds from the 10,000 little giants, meaning being selected, don't earn their revenue doing what they will get the money for. It's quite interesting. And this basically could be explained by, but this is the words versus deeds. The words sound great, but the deeds look very different, because these companies might actually be profitable, that's great, might be very innovative, but they're doing something else. Maybe once think of Xiaomi. Xiaomi, it's not a 10,000 little giant, but doing phones and then suddenly doing electric vehicles and getting money for it. Well, that's what I mean. Maybe Xiaomi does great electric vehicles as well, but it's frankly, for me, the Chinese government is running a risk, because these companies have not proven to be good at doing what they're getting the money for before. So that's when we say, and we have many other results in the paper, that the words and the deeds don't really match. And it's hard to argue whether this is successful or not, but it's very clear that if you do such a rigorous classification of companies with classification of criteria they need to comply with, everything, and suddenly you find that companies are doing totally something else, it kind of ruins the story very much. One could argue this is chronism. I mean, we can't prove what's the reason. We don't go as far as dwelling on the reasons for this, but that would be a very interesting paper. So I'm going to jump a little bit because I don't have much time and I have much more to tell you. One thing to realize is that subsidies, as I said, are across the board. Don't measure industrial policy with subsidies. This is something I have had long discussions with the European Commission before, their anti-subsidy investigation for electric vehicles. That's not what the action is. It's just a tiny bit, and it's very general. Everybody gets subsidies. And yes, they've been increasing over time, true. But again, other things may have been happening that are bigger than subsidies. Yes, some sectors get more subsidies than others. But, it's hard to argue that, I don't know, computers, maybe, yes, they get a lot of subsidies, but maybe because there's many companies that are zombies in that sector. So what we find also, this is not in this presentation, but that I think 70% of the subsidies in China are given to zombie companies, meaning loss-making institutions. So the subsidies are there for many other reasons than industrial policy, basically to save companies, to keep employment. So one lesson to learn is don't focus on subsidies if you want to understand what's going on, because it's just not related. So what do you focus on if you want to do research on this? Well, one thing that is, I think, quite interesting is the fact that China increasingly, and this is because of the fear of leverage. China, since 2017, this famous anonymous letter, if you remember, in the China Daily, which supposedly was Xi Jinping himself, somebody wrote it for him, kind of stopped. The idea was to stop leverage. China was too leveraged. They had to stop this. So one way to still support the companies was to give them equity, not leverage, not debt. And this moved the whole idea of industrial policy to equity funds. So basically government guided funds, as they call them in China. So these government guided funds are a mixture of public money and private money. The national tobacco company is there, which is an SOE. Is that private money? Maybe not, but it's not classified as public money because it's a corporation. You had Alibaba for many years in many of these state government guided funds. So this collusion of SOEs, but even private companies, maybe not choice, maybe they feel that this is a way to make money because these companies are selected by the government, and therefore possibly they won't collapse. So, for all of these reasons, these state-guided funds did very well, especially in 2016, you can see. And the targeted scale was much bigger. I mean, like China was really aiming at 450 state-guided funds in 2016, of which they only got 200. So the reliance on this instrument at the time was humongous. Then, of course, many companies went bust. People lost money. Think about the big fund, the semiconductor big fund 1 and 2. Many of those projects went nowhere. So, the interest for these state-guided funds kind of went down the road. I won't get into who is paying for this. Some are national level, but mostly is local government level. This is important because of the third plenum. Let me link this to the third plenum in a minute. The third plenum, to me, this is my reading, I'm happy to hear your views, takes away, some people read it differently, including Wall Street Journal article that I participated in. They keep on saying, no, but China is going to move part of its consumption taxes to the local governments. Well, their revenue, but not the ability to tax, So the local governments are still like, yes, we need money, but they still, the third plenum doesn't change their dependence on the central government massively. On the contrary, on the expenditure side, which is part of this, the idea is to centralize expenditure much more for a very simple reason, is because local governments are basically not able to spend anymore because of the collapse in revenue, especially land sales. So for me, China is moving, and they have already started with the new basically research. The research endeavor has been centralized with a new agency. So you can tell everything is getting more centralized. So for me, this industrial policy will no longer be so, the idea of, at least in my opinion, part of its success was that local governments were competing and they were choosing their champions. Maybe sometimes not even the right champions, but at least there was some kind of competition to choose the right ones. Because if you didn't, then somebody would do better than you. But as this thing gets more centralized, the question is, will it not get worse? Because there won't be this competition. So this is a very interesting policy thing that I think we could discuss. I think I have very little time left, so I'm going to really jump to the conclusions. I mean, there's a lot of detail as to where the money is going. I mean, I can only tell you this took forever. Bear in mind that I told you about government's guided funds, but don't forget the China's Sovereign Wealth Fund. It's very, very important. So CIC through Central Huijin is extremely important in channeling the money through the banks it is invested in. So Central Huijin has in its hands the recapitalization of banks when they don't do well, etc., etc. Through that, it in a way controls banks lending, which are the key channels for companies to survive. Yeah. So don't think about subsidies. It's much bigger than that. It's really how you get your funding. If you're not supported by the government in a way or another, you won't. And finally, if you are selected as part of this industrial policy, this is the little giants, you have a very big advantage. You are likely to do an IPO, very likely. So increasingly likely for the number of firms, look how few firms which were selected as little giants were managed to do an IPO in 2019, and this keeps on growing. So it's a signaling effect. I trust you, I'm the government, so you can get funding from the banks, you can do an IPO. That's the thing. So it is very powerful, and we won't find it in subsidies. So whoever wants to take China to WTO on subsidies, I'm sorry, but it's going to be very hard. I already fear the commission not being able to prove. I mean, they chose very low, frankly, tariffs for electric vehicles. You probably know 38% is the max. That might be easy to prove because it's not very large. But if you want to go 100 like the US, you'd better do it without any proof, because you're not going to be able to prove that ever. That doesn't mean it's not happening. Was it successful? Very quickly. Well, if you measure success by China moving up the ladder, and I think India is here, so let's work on. You're doing quite well compared to the rest. So look at these lines. When the lines, let me explain you. This is a bit difficult, but I'll take 1 minute. When the lines are above 0, China has moved up the ladder versus you. So this is the blue line is the US, massive. Of course, this goes against the idea that the US is still the dominant player in innovation and so on, but this is not about innovation. Industrial value added and innovation are two different things. Industrial value added is, can you export high value stuff and make money out of that? And China is doing that really well, especially compared to the US, because the US has de-industrialized. But for example, compared to Korea, no. Korea has added more industrial value than China. That's why the number is negative. Yeah, India has lost a bit, as you can see from the gray area. Of course, not as much as the US. Maybe if I take the US out, you are the worst in the sample. So, it would look really big. But I'm saying compared to the US, of course not. But this is also biased by the size of the market, because it's in billion of US dollars. So, I mean, I'm not using this as a whole proof of the fact that India might be losing value added against China. You would need much more analysis for this. But just to tell you that if I want to measure success by value added, China got it all. And frankly, it's doing great, but against most countries. But, and if I look at patents, wow, amazing. Frankly, we're now doing a very detailed analysis of patents, very different, looking at the radical novelty of patents. So this is a totally different exercise, quite hard to do, to be frank. And there we still find the US dominating emerging technologies, not China, except for a few. We can do that on another occasion. But generally, as far as numbers are concerned, China dominates. Huge amount of patents, scientific publications, you name it. So you could say, wow, they're doing great. Robot density, biggest increase after South Korea. So really industrializing, robotizing the economy, you name it. Per sector, I'm going to jump all of this. The second paper has China's measure of success per sector. Space, biotech, some better than others, railway, shipping. I don't have time for all of this, but transportation, you name it. So EVs, of course, highly successful. But, and here's the thing, as an economist, it all depends on what China wants. If the third plenum's objective is self-reliance and compete with the US, they're doing well. But if the objective is to keep Chinese households purchasing power, i.e. to keep the economy going, to continue to grow, given that China is still $13,000 per capita, that, frankly, is not the US, then I'm sorry, China is not doing well, because total factor productivity is falling. I mean, it's decelerating, of course, not yet negative, decelerating. For a country that is putting so much money into research and development, this is astounding. For a country of $13,000 per capita, the fact that you're putting as much money as the European Union as in percentage of GDP, meaning in billions of dollars, because it's a very similar GDP, and you still can't increase your total factor productivity, it's just not good enough, because that's the one and only way China has to grow, to mitigate structural deceleration. Labor is falling, aging. The fixed asset investment put in the economy falling, return on assets falling, labor productivity falling. So there's nothing else than becoming more productive in general sense through innovation. But that is not happening. China's innovation so far is not conducive to increasing productivity. It's a puzzle, but it's a fact. And there's many analyses on this, and looking at, even separate sectors and trying to figure out why. We just launched some ideas in the paper, like maybe sacrifice domestic competition for competitiveness, meaning external exports, and maybe not allowing companies to really compete in the domestic market. Maybe that's the reason. Create champions, but then the not the best ones beat the others. You see what I mean? That which is a little bit what I was pointing at with our results. Local favoritism, China's Gilded Age, meaning rampant cronyism, uncertainty about the business environment. I can only tell you, I can't explain this, but what I know is something is missing for all of this innovation to end up creating growth. I will jump directly to, because I think I made my point. So lessons for the world, it was Europe because the paper talks about Europe, but I think the lessons can be generalized. So first of all, I don't think we can talk about China's industrial policy, just analyze it and say, oh, great, I like this one. I like what they did in EVs. Let's copy that. Because it's entrenched in a different economic model. Literally, I would call it party capitalism at this point, but you can call it state capitalism if you like. But I think by now we may need to switch to party capitalism. I mean, if you think of what I said at the beginning, that industrial policy is there to correct the excesses of party capitalism, then you already see that we're nowhere to copy that model because it has totally different objectives. So I would not extrapolate from China's policy measures. I would really just look at them, understand what could be the impact for the rest of the world. That's very important. Obviously, by now, third plenum, to me, loud and clear, more excess capacity, by all means, because that's what they want to do. More supply, more supply, more supply. Export their way out. So we know where they're going, but that doesn't mean I can copy that model. And also because China is still in transition, it's still not a full market economy. So, I mean, and again, so that's the first thing. And also realizing that China's industrial policy is not a success across the board. I didn't go through the sectors, but you can actually see that some sectors did much better than others. And the question is why? What I think is quite clear is that where China has been more successful is in sectors where there are huge economies of scale. This is crucial for India. I think this is the most important takeaway for me, for India. It could be a takeaway for Europe, but for Europe, I would have to say, where is our single market? Why do we have so many barriers in our single market? I have no idea how many barriers you have in your own single market. I know China has quite a few, to be frank. It's not a perfect single market. I was very disappointed not to see this point being pushed further in the third plenum, because it's a very, very easy, low-hanging fruit for China to harmonize its single market, which is not yet single as we speak. Where is India? I don't know, but the ability to create economies of scale, this is not only about, of course, barriers across states. It's also about, obviously, logistics and and many other things, not which China has. But my point is that that ability to create economies of scale explain a lot of China's success in industrial policy, the way I see it, in the sectors where they really succeeded. So that's all from my side. I think we're done. I'm going to stop sharing and happy to have your comments and views.
Thank you, Alicia. That was marvelous. I think to an already enlightened audience, it was still a masterclass. So thank you for that. It was an absolute treat. And I'm aware that there are a lot of well-informed people on these topics in the audience. So I'll just keep my reactions very short. I've read both your papers multiple times now. And you yourself highlighted many areas for further study and research. But I would just like to make a few comments. One is that, when you examine industrial policy in China and you detect some inefficiencies, how much of do you think is by design? Because in India, we are believers that nothing is perfect. Something comes out and we perfect it. And, we are very forgiving of policies which don't work. So that is my first reaction from an Indian perspective. How much do you think China designs it to be flexible and then corrects the course and gets it right? The second question I have is after MIC 2025, which many people believe triggered the US-China contestation, how much has changed in terms of policy making and especially publishing of data? Because you said one of the advantages of 10,000 small giants is data is more freely available. So I just is this across the board for all policies, or is this a policy in isolation where data is more easily accessible? Because I think a number of members of the audience are researchers. So I would like to hear your views so that they feel more encouraged to dig deeper and find more data and analyze them. And my last remark is that in my introduction, I did not mention third plenum, but you have done a very good job of incorporating the third plenum into your remarks on the two papers. We get that you're disappointed on the third plenum, but I would like to question you on the consumption side of it. Supply side, I think you've already made it very clear. But consumption, what exactly is China trying in the last 2, 3 years? What is working? What is failing? Are there successes, so to speak, where domestic consumption is actually reacting to Chinese policy, or is it just rhetoric where there's very little data available to say that the needle is moving? Because that is something I think people are anxiously waiting to see if domestic consumption responds to policy making. So I'll stop here. You can react to these comments now or weave them into some other questions. I will also read out some questions in the comment box a little later. So I see Ambassador Menon has his hands up, and Ambassador Rana has typed in a question and two others. So Alicia, would you like to react to my comments before moving on to the questions?
I'll be very brief, but just so that I don't forget,
Sure.
very quickly. So is China doing, are these imperfections on purpose? Well, I would say that would be too much, but I agree with you that and this is why the 10,000 Little Giants are such a good data set, your second point, because I can compare batches. The first one was in 2019, and then 2020, 2021, etc. So as we move on to 2023, I think that the last batch in our sample, research and development intensity becomes significant, meaning they choose companies that are more research oriented, not in the first batch. So I could read this as a way to, if they're doing the same analysis, which I frankly don't know, but I imagine, somebody's doing it, they can see the improvement in the choice of companies. They still don't choose those doing what they give the money for, but that's a different point. That there they don't change. But on data, I mean, it's a big problem. Again, the idea that this massive Made in China 2025, we don't even know which companies were selected, says it all. Now, do we know in other countries? Well, I've not done research on industrial policy in many countries, so I can't really tell you whether this degree of transparency is normal or not. I imagine it's probably less than average, but that's the average in China anyway. So now, will they continue to publish batches from the 10,000 Little Giants if people keep on doing research like us? Maybe not. So I would keep it rather secret, but of course we can't because we already published the journal paper. So yeah, and we got a lot of questions from Chinese, and by the way, by the US State Department, not only by Chinese academics and officials. So, I think many people are using this data now because it's the one and only really available where you can do this. Third plenum, consumption. I'm sorry, there's hardly anything there. It's mentioned a couple of times, no specific measures. Is this worrisome? Very much, very much. I would say we don't even have, I would argue that pension reform could have been maybe it would have created more uncertainties because we know that there is a huge gap in the pension system in China. But frankly, maybe they could have at least, there's little portability across provinces, so they could have at least said, we're going to deal with this problem. Yeah, I would argue that whatever relates to excess savings or precautionary savings related to the lack of a welfare state, not a word. Subsidies for consumption, not a word. Subsidies for production, well, they don't say they will give subsidies, but the point is it's really all geared towards production. I don't think the third plenum recognizes the degree of, how unbalanced the Chinese economy is today. They also don't recognize, yes, they talk massively about external, the West the threat from the West, but they don't really say, look, we are going to face less external demand, let's consume more at home. There's no such, and most importantly, how. They don't say how they're going to do that. So on this third question, which is very important, I would say that the third plenum is particularly disappointing, underwhelming measures-wise. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Alicia. I'll just read out 3 questions from the chat box and then Ambassador Menon can raise this question and maybe you can take them all together. We have 10 minutes to go. So the first question in the chat box is from Ambassador Kishan Rana. He said China wants to borrow from German Mittelstand and Japan to promote medium and small industries. Is this possible under party state capitalism, which you mentioned? And his second question is, has the third plenum turned out to be a damn squib? I think you have reacted to that. The second question in the chat box is from Kant Kumar. Is it possible for democratic countries to support private sector industries like Chinese characterized socialist China? And the third question from Mr. Ravi Bhutlingam is, how valid is the perception that there exists huge overcapacity? Is there a common understanding of what overcapacity actually means in China? So these are the 3 questions. So Ambassador Menon, would you like to ask your question now, please?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alicia, for a really fascinating talk. I learned a lot. And I thought the bit where you said, what lessons can we learn and can we not learn, I think was particularly good. My question is, did I hear you right saying that they are centralizing expenditure? Because if that's the case, it seems to go against everything else. I mean, the debt is local, and I'm not quite sure if they're actually going to farm out more taxes, even though it's still the center's right. If more taxes go to the provinces and to the cities, how does this work? And surely it's, as you said, will create more excess capacity, will limit the growth of private consumption in the economy of domestic consumption. So is that really where they are serious about this, about centralizing expenditure? It also, of course, creates a single point of failure, which to my mind is more dangerous in an economy like that. But anyway.
Yes, Alicia. You want to
Okay, so
react?
first of all, thank you for these very good questions coming from two ambassadors. Sorry that I used your first name. I now realize I shouldn't. Really sorry.
You should.
Apologies.
You know us well enough.
Yes, thank you so much, Ambassador Menon. But let me start with sorry, Ambassador Rana. So the Mittelstand, yes. So that indeed the 10,000 Little Giants in one of the first documents describing this strategy, they refer to the Mittelstand. So clearly that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to create a dynamic set of companies that could become large. Some of them maybe are already, because China, given the economies of scale, it's hard to think of very small companies being paid attention. Yeah, but the question really is, will this be successful? Well, in some sectors, it has been successful. At least if you look at, the strength of China's green tech, or I have no doubt that some companies will be successful. But the question is, are they successful because of the support? Well, again, maybe if you think of a world, China's world, where you can't have access to financing unless you go through the local government, your connections, blah, blah, blah. In a way, what this does is it eases the signaling effect. The signaling effect goes beyond your province. So if you are a little giant, maybe a bigger bank outside of your province will lend to you. Maybe you do an IPO. So it's easier for you to become much bigger. I think that's the point of this program, because you're no longer only dependent on your local government, as would have been, this chronism that characterizes China's party or local government company relations. So in a way, it's better than what they had. I mean, I would answer this question in the following way. Maybe it's not perfect, but it is an improvement compared to what they had before. How much can they do? Well, as I said, in some sectors they might not be successful, but I would argue that the 10,000 Little Giants, for what China is worth in terms of state capitalism, is probably among the best I've seen, because it's very clear, you know what you need to do. And if you get signaled by the government, you can move on, you can get funding, you can be bigger, So I'm already telling you that we are now in the third paper of this series, looking at whether these 10,000 Little Giants export more than others, their peers. So we're trying to see whether these policies help them become big exporters. I was assuming this would be the case, because I thought that was kind of the objective. We don't find that. They don't export more. And I think the reason, going back to your question implies, is this really successful? Maybe eventually, maybe not. And let me tell you, in the sense that, yes, they become bigger because they're signaled, they're chosen, but maybe they become also more accommodating because they're chosen. They don't need to fight their way out. So in fact, the companies that export more and controlling for a lot of things, it's a long story, are the others, not the 10,000 Little Giants. We control per sector, per type of company, everything. Why? Because those need to fight their way. They need to, So maybe the irony is maybe eventually not so successful, because, you accommodate these companies. You make them, You make their life easier, if I may. So that's the first question. I guess the second is very similar. I mean, it's possible for democratic countries to support its private sector. Well, I would say copying the 10,000 little giants, it doesn't matter whether you are a democracy or not. You can do this. You pool funds, you create criteria, you choose the companies, you have whatever, a national board for competitiveness, you name it. I don't see why a democratic country could not do this. Now, of course, as I said, this is just part of China's state capitalism. There's many other things we can't copy, or we shouldn't copy in a way, because that's cronyism. So I would say, if I narrow down to what I've studied, yes, we can copy it, but that's just the tiny, that's the drop in the ocean of what China is as a state capitalist or party capitalist economy. So the rest we can't and we shouldn't copy, in my view. So overcapacity is huge. Yes, it is huge, but we can't prove how big it is, because I did some calculations on overcapacity in 2016. I can only tell you that the data I used then for steel, for cement, trying to replicate the ratios of capacity utilization that China was making public, that data doesn't exist today. So I'm not able to calculate it anymore. And for some sectors like electric vehicles, it's impossible because we don't know the future demand. It's a new sector. So it's just very hard for me to, but do I believe there is excess capacity? Humongous. And why do I say that? Because producer prices are highly negative. It's very simple. If you just read the solar panel sector in China, how worried they are because prices keep on plummeting. How can I not know this overcapacity? If China already has 90%, between 80 to 90% of global market share, you need the moon to export China's capacity. Because the moon is not yet inhabited, it's very easy for me to say there is overcapacity. But that's the only sector where it is crystal clear, if you see what I mean. For others, it's very hard because you can say, but China can increase market share, export market share globally. China can do that. I mean, if I were the US, going back to Janet Yellen's official visit, last official visit to China, I would not even engage in mentioning overcapacity. I'm going to be very blunt here. Like I would say, the hell with it. Meaning, you don't want to recognize your overcapacity, deal with deflation. Look at what happened with Japan. In a way, I mean, because I'm not part of this strategic competition. I'm not a US national. I'm not in the US Treasury. So, but if I were them, I would not even mention, because that's the worst that can happen to a country, to a country's economy. It's, in a way, sorry to say, a little bit stupid to keep on telling them, and they deny it, because if one day they realize, maybe they'll change the policy. If that's your game, if your game is to contain China, deflation is the best way out. China's economy is literally decoupling, let's use that word in a different way, from the US in the following way. Their nominal GDP is growing only 4%, China, 4%. US nominal GDP is growing much faster because inflation is higher. So the divergence in dollar terms in their GDP is growing since 2022, growing. China is not converging to the US, it's diverging. Let's call it decoupling. So the more China deflates, the better for the US. I mean, now, of course, excess capacity is terrible for anybody who wants to compete in third markets. Europe, not the US. The US is an importer. Europe. Or if India wants to develop its own industry, it's terrible because they dump all of these cheap imports. Terrible. But for the US, it's a no-brainer. I don't know why they insist. I mean, I want to make it a little bit kind of counterintuitive, but just to say that I would not keep on telling them you have excess capacity, because they don't want to know. I'm sure they know. They deny something that is obvious to me, that is it really, and most importantly, is a really bad thing for China. It's also a bad thing for many others, to be frank. But the only thing you can do is to impose tariffs. I'm sorry, there's nothing else you can do if this is not recognized. If China does not increase domestic demand, there's nothing else the world can do than put barriers. I'm very sorry. Supposedly an orthodox economist, so saying this is very painful, but this is the way it is, because China's size is just too large if there's not domestic demand to absorb that capacity, which keeps on growing. So that's, and finally, on the issue of centralized expenditure, it's very, very good point. Okay, the readout talks about centralizing expenditure. The full document on Sunday focuses, is very interesting, focuses on decentralizing revenue. So it's like very, very contradictory. I think what this means, it doesn't say anywhere they're going to decentralize taxes, only revenue. Meaning, I checked a little bit, like excise taxes, like alcohol, the consumption taxes. The local governments get a share of that, which is not the same per province, and it's not a big deal. It's like maybe 5% of total revenue. Maybe they will get double. Okay, fine. But it's still, the decision is still in the central government, if you see what I mean. Like I think the central government wants to still hold make the local governments as accountable as possible. They want to make sure, they want to give them some revenue because they don't want them to borrow, because it's very expensive for them to borrow now. And they are really, they can't breathe. They want to centralize expenditure first because the local governments can't cover a lot of that expenditure by now, like infrastructure expenditure, for example. And secondly, because if they borrow to pay for that, it's too costly. So Xi Jinping, and this is already something that Xi Jinping has said well before the plenum, he wants the central government to issue more, not the local governments. So of course they will centralize some expenditure, because at the end of the day, what they're trying to do is the local governments become much more dependent on the central government. Now, I fully agree with you, Ambassador, that this is very dangerous, because local governments are not going to like it. This could end really badly, especially if this is not organized well, if you see what I mean. Some governments, local governments, might be in their shape. The citizens will not know why whatever that might be, their salaries will be paid locally, but why their schools are not finished, or whatever infrastructure. So changing this could bring a lot of instability to the local central government relations, and I think this is very dangerous. But probably Xi Jinping thinks he can do it. He has enough control. Second, he really worries about a default of a local government, especially financial vehicle, so not the local government as such. So he just doesn't want to run the financial risk. So the best thing he can think of is, I centralize it. I take care. I can issue that much more cheaply. I don't think he's realizing how dangerous this is, in my opinion. But this is up to China to, of course, to decide. Yeah.
Thank you, Alicia. I think we have run past the allotted time, but on behalf of everyone at Institute of Chinese Studies and the people who have attended today's session and those who will be watching it on YouTube later, I want to heartily thank you for joining us, taking the time. I know your travel schedule is very busy, but I hope you can visit India to interact more with our community of China watchers. And if nothing else, we will invite you more often for virtual discussions. The learning value is great, and we really appreciate your insights that you have shared today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pai. I seek your permission to formally bring an end to today's session. With this, we come to the end of today's seminar. We thank Dr. Alicia Garcia Herrero and Mr. Santosh Pai for gracing today's seminar with their presence and for giving us their precious time. We also offer our gratitude to the audience. The video of today's seminar shall be available on the ICS YouTube channel. We extend a warm invitation to all for the upcoming Wednesday seminar scheduled for 31 July 2024 at 3 p.m. IST. The title of the seminar is Middle Powers in an Age of Geopolitical Rivalry. Details about the event can be found on the ICS website, or you can subscribe to our newsletters for regular updates. Thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thank you. Bye-bye.